Many thanks to Michelle. We will keep questions for the end. So now I'm delighted to introduce our second speakers, Matthew Greenhall and Christina Kamposiori from our colleagues across the water in Research Libraries UK. And the title for the talk is New Frontiers of Digital Access, the Development and Delivery of Virtual Reading Rooms and Virtual Teaching Spaces amongst Collection Holding Institutions. Matt and Christina, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Excuse me. Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here, and thank you to the conference organisers for allowing us to speak today. So my name is Matt Greenhall. I'm the Deputy Director at RLUK, and I'm presenting with my colleague Christina Kamposiori, who is the Executive Programme Officer. And we're going to come and speak to you today really about some work that RLUK has been undertaking around the development and delivery of what we're terming virtual reading rooms and virtual teaching spaces. And we'd like to do really four key things. Firstly, very briefly define what we mean by these terms. Secondly, talk a little bit about the COVID context in which we've seen these emerge in greater numbers over the last 2 years. Then thirdly, talk a bit about some of the results from some research that RLUK has been undertaking regarding their development, their use, and particularly their perception amongst academics, before then finishing with a few comments around some of the collaborative opportunities around these services. So just to start with, what do we mean by virtual reading room and virtual teaching space? We've used this definition, which has been created by a working group that RLUK has convened. And really how we've defined these two services is that they provide humanly mediated remote digital access to collections which don't depend on digitisation. In their very essence, this is about using high-res visualisers within search rooms and reading rooms to present original materials via Zoom or another platform to a researcher or a group of students who are geographically distant. These are emerging services, they're bespoke, they're really staff-intensive, but they're a really great way of not only showcasing collections, but also staff expertise. And we'll talk about this a little further. So this is really virtual reading rooms, and virtual teaching spaces are a variation of this. But the content is being delivered to a larger group of students or learners, either in a classroom somewhere remote, or through joining multiple links via Zoom. We'll mainly be talking about virtual reading rooms today, but I think a lot of what we say can apply to virtual teaching spaces. So although these services were seen to exist before the COVID-19 pandemic, we've seen that their number has increased significantly as the pandemic progressed, particularly as there were experiences of lockdowns, partial lockdowns, and partial reopenings. In the research that RLUK has undertaken over the last 2 years, we found 45 different institutions which have developed or intend to develop and deliver virtual reading room services. And one of the things that's really striking about this is the geographical variety of the institutions which are creating these. Some of these are in the Republic of Ireland, in the UK, in Germany, Greece, the Netherlands, USA, Australia, and New Zealand. And we think these 45 institutions are just the very tip of the iceberg. There's actually a far greater number of libraries and archives which are creating these services. Now, the circumstances in which these developed are quite specific. We've seen that they were a response to the closure and then the partial reopening of library and archive buildings. And in the UK in particular, we noticed the number of virtual reading room services increasing at a time when staff could re-enter buildings and staff could get access to collections, but users were still not permitted to enter buildings or access those same collections. So we saw that these services emerged from quite a specific position. One of the things that this has also highlighted, and a few reflections that we had during the early stages of the pandemic, was the ingenuity of librarians and archivists in providing these services. In the image here on screen, you can see colleagues from Princeton who erected a virtual reading room in their kitchen using a milk float, a ruler, an iPhone, and facsimiles in order to deliver online teaching sessions to geographically remote students and users. So we've been charting the development of these services really from late 2020, and we've published some research and some reports which are available on the RLUK website. And we'll talk through some of the headline results of these now. So the first piece of research that we conducted was that really when these services were just starting to take hold. We started seeing their numbers increase from late 2020, and by early 2021 we saw that these were phenomena which libraries and archives were increasingly developing. So we undertook a survey. This was both of RLUK members, but also institutions beyond the RLUK membership. And we had 32 institutions who responded. What was immediately clear from this very first survey was that these were emerging services and that they were being developed and housed in a great variety of different institutions. We were seeing them in major research libraries belonging to large research-intensive universities, and we were seeing them develop in small charitable archives and independent institutions. We're seeing that they were in museums and in heritage centres. There was a real breadth of institutions who were creating these and using them to provide virtual access to their collections when people weren't able to enter their buildings. We also noticed a real mixed economy of approaches. So some institutions were investing really heavily in high-spec ceiling-mounted visualisers, where others were simply using off-the-shelf webcams bought for a few pounds. There was a real wide variety of approaches being taken, and that was a low technological baseline. These were quite accessible in order to create within institutions. We also noted that mobility and flexibility in creating these services was really essential. Being able to move visualisers around buildings, take them to collections, take them to different stores. And as a result of these emerging quite quickly, and also having a relatively low technological baseline, they were overwhelmingly funded from inside institutions, particularly in these early stages. But what was really interesting in this early research is that these emerged initially as a very pragmatic response of how do we provide virtual access to non-digitised collections when our users can't enter our buildings. We then noticed this transition to them becoming increasingly bespoke research services, that they continued beyond the immediate lockdown scenario which created them, and their number continued to increase when lockdown and restrictions were being lifted. Although user numbers were quite modest, generally ranging between 1 and 30 one-hour bookings per virtual reading room service, they were increasing in number and duration. And we started exploring how these services could provide additional means of digital access to collections, which didn't depend on digitisation, but also how virtual reading rooms and teaching spaces were seen increasingly as risk mitigation within institutions who, as we've heard and discussed already in the last day and a half, expect further pandemics and potential restrictions. Two other points to reflect on from this early research is that we were seeing a diversification of the audience of these services. Initially, virtual reading rooms were being provided by libraries and archives very much for their institutional users, for their own academics and their students. But we noted over the period of the research that increasingly external users, external researchers, wherever they might be around the world, were increasingly becoming the key main audience for these services. We were also seeing a diversification of application. Initially, these were very much focused on archival and special collections material, but were increasingly now being applied to museum objects, to gallery items, also seeing the combination of analog collections being presented through a visualizer and then data and digital collections being presented simultaneously via screen sharing. So we're seeing a diversification in how this technology was being applied. Finally, before I hand over to Christina, one of the other key things we noticed from this early research was how it positioned members of staff, as we've touched on already, not just providers of a service, but actually as research partners. That relationship being built up via Zoom between a search member of staff who was presenting these materials and the remote researcher gave that member of staff a really unique insight into what that researcher was looking for, why they were interrogating documents in the way they were, why they wanted them positioned. And we saw that position of research partner beginning to be factored into funding applications around virtual reading rooms, which position members of staff as research partners in that process. It also demonstrates, I think, from those earlier pictures from Princeton, how librarians and archivists really were pioneers in reacting at incredible speed to the adversity that they were facing to provide access to content. So this is just a bit of an overview in terms of where these services have come from in the early stages. And I'm going to hand over to Christina, who's going to talk how they've continued to develop, and particularly how they've been used and perceived by academics.
Hello, everyone. It's very nice to be here, and thank you, Matt. So I'll go to the next slide. All right, so this second survey was launched in November 2021 and closed in January 2022, as was the case with our first survey. This was circulated across the RLUK community, but also beyond that to the international cultural heritage community. So this second survey aimed to document the most recent developments in the area of virtual reading rooms and virtual teaching spaces. And for this reason, we again examined a variety of issues related to the practices and requirements for developing and delivering these services. So in this second survey, we had 22 institutions participating. So within these were 13 library and archive institutions from across the UK, Ireland, USA, and Australia that hadn't participated in the first survey. So that really helped develop our understanding about what was going on at the time of the second survey around the world on this area. So for the purposes of this presentation, I will focus on two areas of the findings that were considered of importance for the institutions currently planning the future of the services. So first I will talk about the space requirements for housing the services, and then I will say a few things about the steps that many institutions are taking to achieve sustainability and sustain their resources, these services. So thinking about space, it was really interesting to look at the findings and especially with regards to the criteria and the rationale behind choosing the right place to house the services. So for those with established virtual reading rooms, the space availability, adaptability, and security were the key reasons for choosing a space to house the services. For those intending to establish their virtual reading rooms, they said that space availability, service availability, and adjacency to collection store were some of the things that they were looking for when searching for a space to house the services. Regarding virtual teaching spaces, so the majority of institutions from both categories said that space availability was usually the driving factor for choosing a space. What was particularly interesting, regardless of the category to which these institutions belonged, meaning whether they already had their services established or they were planning to establish the services, was that at the time of the second survey they still hadn't found permanent space to house the services. And so for the majority of them, a space was a primary consideration when looking into the future. And also, many of the participants shared with us some of the criteria for the ideal space for them, what they were looking for at the time. So, and that would be like flexible spaces to support the delivery of various types of sessions, not only online anymore, but hybrid and blended sessions. So thinking about sustainability, so based on our results of this second survey, it was very interesting to see that virtual reading rooms and virtual teaching spaces were not considered anymore an emergency type service, but have been started to be integrated into the existing service offering of institutions. And we've seen, for example, that current processes and lessons learned have started to be embedded in strategic plans. For example, there were some interesting lessons learned around the relationship between the virtual reading rooms and virtual teaching spaces and the digitization of collections, as well as and cataloging. So as part of their plans for the future, many of the participants said that they plan to re-promote their services to the audience groups that would most benefit. And that could include, for example, users concerned with travel due to environmental reasons, costs, or maybe users with mobility issues. And also, while thinking about the future, many of them are trying to currently secure more resources. That includes funds to support the development and delivery of the services, more staff members to deliver the services and spaces as well. And they are looking to invest in skills development for staff, especially given the fact that, as was the case with the first survey, staff that were involved in delivering virtual reading room services and virtual teaching spaces, they have been found to be actively involved in research and partnering many times. So yeah, that was a really good reason to invest in skills development. And just finally, some of the plans about their future activities. So in securing sustainability, it's about cross-institutional collaboration, but I will leave this to my colleague Matt to later when concluding the survey, the presentation to mention some things on that. So, but before handing back to Matt, I would like to say a few things about our latest survey. This was launched in April and closed in early May. So our target group was the international academic and research community, and the aim was to to explore the academic experience and perceptions of virtual reading rooms and virtual teaching spaces. And that was because we believe that as institutions are moving forward and considering the future of the services, it will be important to take into account the user perspective. And I should mention at this point that this was a collaboration between Research Libraries UK, the School of Advanced Study at the University of London, and the IARLA network. So, and within this survey, we looked at the experiences of users with VRRs and VTSs, their motivation behind the use, and the possibilities of VRRs. So, we had 38 academics, researchers, and PhD students from across the world who completed the survey. So, and in terms of use, an interesting aspect of the findings was that the majority of those who responded were non-users of the services, and they actually, around 70% of them told us that they had no awareness of the services. However, there was a small proportion that hadn't used before, but they were planning to use this. And this can potentially be something that institutions would like to consider when planning to re-promote the services to different audio groups in the future. However, there were existing users who had positive experiences, and that was, again, very important. Thinking again about use, the reference, the services was mostly used for reference checking and confirming document content, as well as consulting particularly archival material. In terms of perceived benefits, it was really interesting to notice that the most voted benefit could be that the fact that these services can be environmentally friendly, with access to non-digitized, with the provision of access to non-digitized material and the speeding up of research as the next most voted benefits. So these are some very quick, the top 5 reasons behind motivating users for using the services, as well as reflecting some of the possibilities that VRRs can have. Like the first is about the opportunity to view material that's otherwise difficult to access. The fact that some of the users said that if there was a larger range of collection material to consult, that would be of interest to many. However, there should be a greater awareness of VRRs and their possibilities. And finally, in this section, the opportunity to order digital copies of material, as well as view more than one collection or collection items per session, would be a draw factor for many users. And just before I hand over to Matt, so in terms of the circumstances under which this will be valuable, so this can be when the collection items required are not digitized, to limit travel, and to evaluate the need for an in-person visit. So back to Matt.
So just to quickly finish, I know we're almost out of time. One of the things that I think we've really benefited from in terms of the research that's been happening is the potential for international collaboration We're seeing these around the globe. We're seeing them created for a variety of reasons, now not just in response to COVID, but around environmental sustainability, access and inclusivity, and a number of the other reasons that Christina highlighted. RLUK has come together with some of our international partners in North America, in Australia and New Zealand, and across all of Europe through LIBA to explore what is the potential collaboration around these services, what are our collective experiences, what are the lessons that we might share and learn from one another. And you can see some of the potential areas there around skills development, around benchmarking, how often are these used and how are we finding the use of collections changing, is there possibilities around common standards and common approaches. These are all ideas that we're testing and we're exploring, and we will be having an event in the autumn, in November time, which is going to be looking at creating an international toolkit to bring together all these different institutional experiences into a how-to guide for any other library or archive who would like to experiment and see if this is right for them. If you're interested in participating in this work, we are absolutely would welcome and would relish working with Conul members around this. So if you are interested and you would like a conversation about how you could be involved, please don't hesitate to speak to Christina or myself today or send us an email. So thank you very much for your time. Thank you.
Many thanks to Matt and Christina.